Now I'm sharing my screen. So we go to car body, and the first one needs to be constrained to default, and it turns this yellow color. It says fully constrained up here. All right, and then the next one we want to bring in is the hamster wheel assembly. And these have holes that we want to correspond to these holes. So I will say this axis here needs to correspond to this axis here. And instead of a distance constraint here, we want coincident. And these show up underneath the placement tab. So this is our first constraint. We want a new constraint that's going to be this axis and this axis. And that should get it in the right orientation, but we can still move up and down here. The last constraint we need is the bottom surface and the top surface of the car. And with that constraint there, we can select OK. And so both of these are fully constrained now. I'm going to turn off these planes because they're kind of getting in the way. And the axis display, or the coordinate system display. Okay, next thing I want to do is I want to put a pulley on this shaft here. And so if we go and to assemble and then hamster pulley, we can grab the hamster pulley, and we want to constrain that axis that goes through the hamster pulley to this axis that goes through the kind of cage shaft there. And we want it to be coincident. So I'm going to drop down coincident. So those are exactly aligned now, but we need to then say how far does this need to go in and out. And how we do that is we go new constraint, and we grab this surface, and we say we want to place it right up against this surface. And that's coincident, and now it says it's fully constrained, so we can check mark that. Now what do we do after this? Well, I think bringing in the wheels and the axles, I think, is the best. So I'm going to start out with an axle. So hamster axle, and bring that in. Nope, not that one. That's not the one I wanted. Wheel axle, I think it's called. Wheel axle. Yeah, there you go. And we want this axis constrained to this axis. We want those coincident. And then the next constraint is we want this surface to be right up against this surface, so touching this surface there. And then we select OK, and that's one wheel axle. Let's do the other. So just repeat the process, bring in a wheel axle. We have axis to this axis, that's coincident. And then we want this surface to be right up against this surface, and we'll say coincident there. Fully constrained, check mark that. Now the wheels. Let's do the wheels. So assemble, we go to wheel, and similarly to the axles here, what we do is just align the axes of both of those. We want those coincident. And then we just say that we want this surface to touch up against this surface, and we say that's coincident.
All right, okay, I did it now.
You got it now?
Yeah, I just basically redid it. I deleted all the constraints and redid it.
Just redid the constraints. Yeah, that's a good point. So if you ever get stuck, you can go back in and go to placement, and you can right click and delete all of these constraints if you want and start over. So let's go and do the other wheel. And so I have axis to this axis, and then this, that's coincident. And then this surface up against this surface, and that's coincident. Now, if you get really good at this, you can actually copy and paste. So if I just do Control C, Control V here, it's going to paste a new thing, and all I need to do is click this axis and this surface, and it should Almost. All I need to do is hit flip there, and then that. So let's bring in the last wheel. We go to wheel. We go to from this axis and attach it to this axis, and that's coincident. And then lastly, let's put this surface right up against this surface and make those coincident. So those are the 4 wheels in there. We have 4 wheels. Now we need a axle pulley. So there's a belt that connects this pulley to this pulley that goes around the axle. So I'll go to axle pulley here. Let's grab that. And kind of the same procedure. We want this axis constrained to this axis, coincident. And the question becomes, where do we actually put this on this shaft here? Well, it comes down to we want the belt to line up. The belt runs straight. So there's actually 2 planes. There's one that runs right down the middle of the pulley here. And there's also one that runs right down the middle of this pulley. And we want to make those coincident. So if we make those coincident, coincident, those are directly lined up now. So those are lined up. I'm going to turn off my planes here. And now let's bring in the belt. So we have the 2 pulleys there, and now we can bring in the belt. So I'm going to select this and select belt. And the belt has a few axes included on it that you can align. So I'm going to align this one first with this axis up here and say coincident. And then I'm going to go new constraint, and I'm going to align this axis with this axis here. And so it's lined up that way, but we just don't know how far it is in and out here. Well, just like the pulley, the belt has a plane that runs right down the middle. So if we go to new constraint, we can add this plane right to this plane, and we say coincident there. And that makes that belt fit just perfectly there. So you see the belt fits both of those pulleys just perfectly.
Wait, I wasn't thinking. Would you like the bottom part, you know, the yellow thing right there at the bottom?
This?
Yeah. Would you constrain like the back end of the belt to that part too? Or like, would it just automatically go on there once you put the plane, once you constrain the plane to the...
So when I put this pulley in here,
Yeah.
the plane that goes through this pulley, the middle of this pulley right here,
Yeah.
actually lines up with the middle of this pulley. I made that constraint. So when you put the belt in,
You gotta move the plane back.
if you align it to this plane up here, then it's automatically going to be aligned to the plane down there. So you don't have to do both. You don't have to do both. And then the last thing is the bolts and the nuts. So I'm going to say 440 bolt, and this should have an axis right through the middle. I'm going to grab that axis and then constrain it to this axis and say coincident. And then I have to make sure that the bottom here of that screw or that bolt, let me pull it up a little bit further so I can see the bottom. This bottom right here of this bolt head needs to be constrained right up against that green part. So that needs to be coincident. So it's right back down in there. And then the same thing for another bolt. I'm going to do another bolt. So the axis there is aligned with this axis. Yep. And then the head there, the bottom of the head is aligned with this surface here, and that should be coincident. And the last piece is the nuts on the bottom. So the nuts, same sort of procedure. We start out with the axis. Oh, where's the axis? Click that. Click the axis of the bolt and say coincident. And then we just need to bind the surfaces together. That surface needs to be right up against the bottom of the car. Coincident. And then we just grab another nut. And then we say the axis to the axis. Coincident. And then the top of the nut there to the bottom of the car, and that should be coincident as well. And that's the entire car. So it took me about 5, maybe 10 minutes to do that, but shouldn't take too long.